Great.
All right.
So welcome to the first session of Difference in Repetition for the 21st century. I'm going to pass it off to the instructor, Levi Bryant.
All right, so welcome everyone. It's good to see all of you. We won't talk about a whole lot tonight. In fact, it'll be a pretty short class because we haven't gotten into any material yet. But I thought we could start by talking a little bit about how the class will be structured, hopefully, and what that'll look like, and a little bit about the material. But before getting to any of that, just some maybe guidelines as to how we should conduct ourselves in here. It would be my preference that you keep your videos on so that we can see each other. It's a little bit difficult to talk to a blank screen. I would ask that you avoid using the sidebar to type comments, to instead speak them, because it gets a little bit too busy when the sidebar is used, and that we try and focus on the close reading of the material. And so I thought that perhaps we could start today by introducing ourselves and telling me a little bit about yourself, so we can know where we're coming from. And so maybe we could go from left to right, starting with Dave over here.
Not me, that's me.
Yes, that's you.
Hi everybody, I'm Dave McCarricker. I'm an adjunct instructor at Boise State University, director of a nonprofit startup, and I found out about this through Michael Downs. So really happy to be joining you all, and I've spent the last 2 months kind of catching up with Levi's older videos in the archives from the other Deleuze courses, so really excited to do this.
Ian?
Ian?
Ian, yes. Ian, I'm not in academia. I picked up a master's a couple years back just for the fun of it, and just sort of continuing engagement is why I'm here.
Great.
What's your background, Ian?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sure. I'm currently an attorney.
Okay.
And again, I picked up, undergrad philosophy, and then picked up a master's in philosophy just a couple years ago.
Great. Jacob?
Hi, I'm Jacob. My background, I have a master's degree in library and information studies and a BA in political science. I just got my master's degree last year and am now living in Detroit, just volunteering and stuff like that.
Great. Joanna?
Oh, hi. Is that me? Yep. Hi,
Yes.
I'm Joanne. I'm an artist, and I'm currently enrolled in Master of Fine Arts. And it's both studio-based and research-based MFA. And big part of my research is Deleuze and rhizomes and all that sort of that area. So that's one.
And where are you at, Joanne?
I'm in Australia, and I'm studying at the National Art School.
Okay, what time is it there right now?
It's 10:50 Friday morning.
Oh, good. So that'll work out well.
It works okay for me.
Okay, John?
Hello, everybody. I'm John Wallace. So I'm in New York right now, Brooklyn. I practice as an analyst here, therapist. So I've studied a lot of Lacan and taking classes at the New Center last semester and this semester, and taken a few others. So yeah, I suppose Deleuze is one of my research interests at the moment. So this is good timing for me. So I'm excited to start with you guys.
Great. Julian?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize I was the next one there. I'm in Victoria. I work at the Pacific Center for Culture and Technology. And I just finished my master's last April, writing about Foucault and friendship, and going to be starting a PhD at the University of Western Ontario next year. And I'm interested in Deleuze's kind of relationship to phenomenology and perception. And my background is in philosophy and politics.
And Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael Downs, and I am currently a certificate student at the New Center for Research and Practice, finishing up the program currently. I think this will be my last class or second to last with the New Center. My background's in Heidegger and phenomenology and Marxism, but over the last few years, I've gotten more and more interested in Lacanian psychoanalysis and Deleuze and Guattari, and they're kind of at the center of my focus now, and Baudrillard. So yeah, very excited to study Deleuze's masterpiece here.
Great. All right, so basically, hopefully we will be able to have a lot of discussion in this seminar over the course of the semester. The class goes much better with that sort of discussion, so please come prepared. The way I would like to structure things is every week I would like for either one or two students to begin the class by presenting the material, and that doesn't need to be nearly as ominous as it might sound. It could merely be a set of questions for like 10 or 15 minutes to start off discussion about what we read for that week. We'll be starting what for all intents and purposes will be the first class next Thursday, which will cover the introduction to difference and repetition. Can we have a volunteer who might give us questions for the introduction? And over the weekend, I will post a schedule of the readings as well. But would somebody like to present the preface and the introduction?
I can volunteer if no one else wants to.
This is Julian. Okay. And after the introduction, we'll actually be leaping ahead in the book to the image of thought. And so that would be chapter 3. And then we'll be reading the book sequentially from chapter 1, difference in itself, chapter 2, repetition for itself, and then the chapter on ideas and the asymmetrical synthesis of the sensible, as well as the conclusion. And the way things might end up working out, we might actually, if nobody objects, end up extending the seminar one additional class meeting. Is that okay with all of you if we do that? Because I think we're going to want to go because it is such a dense work. And, arguably, this is, in my opinion, Deleuze's magnum opus. This is a master work, which in many respects, everything comes out of this book, we find. And it's a tremendously ambitious book as well. It's very difficult to pinpoint. It is simultaneously a theory of aesthetics. It is an ontology or metaphysics, a theory of reality. We find an epistemology at work there. There's a rich ethical content that is difficult to suss out. And it is a tremendously intricate and challenging work on a number of levels. How many of you have read the Difference and Repetition before, by any chance? I know, Joanne, we had you have a bit of expertise with Deleuze here, but it is a deeply challenging work. So hopefully we can make some headway in understanding what it is that he's up to. I thought, today we might, begin just with a couple of passages from Deleuze, things to think about as we begin to approach the work. And in one of the prefaces, there's a really lovely passage. It's on page 21, and I believe is there only a Columbia version of Difference in Repetition? I had been under the impression that they had come out with a continuum version, but I just want to make sure everybody is using the same version.
I think there is a continuum version. I could check, but that sounds right to me.
Good. And so on page 21, Deleuze writes, it's towards the top page, the third sentence in, he says, the task of modern philosophy is to overcome the alternative, temporal, non-temporal, historical, eternal, and particular, universal. Following Nietzsche, we discover as more profound than time and eternity, the untimely. Philosophy is neither a philosophy of history nor a philosophy of the eternal, but untimely, always and only untimely. That is to say, acting counter to our time and thereby acting on our time, and let us hope, for the benefit of a time to come. And so we read the book in these sorts of terms as an untimely work. I think the sort of question that we might ask ourselves as we approach the text is, what is it about the time in which this work is written, and perhaps for us today, continuing today, that this text is responding to? In what way are the concepts of difference and repetition attempting to act counter to our time and against our time? And elsewhere in an interview that Deleuze gives, let me see if I can find it here, on the nature of philosophy, it's entitled On Philosophy and Negotiations. And so Deleuze gives us a sort of picture of how to read philosophy, or approaches reading the history of philosophy. He tells us, and he'll go on later on to develop this thesis and what is philosophy, and in numerous lectures, he says, this is on page 136 of Negotiations for those who have it. Philosophers introduce new concepts. They explain them, but they don't tell us, not completely anyway, the problem to which those concepts are a response. Hume, for example, set out a novel concept of belief. He doesn't tell us how and why the problem of knowledge presents itself in such a way that knowledge is seen as a particular kind of belief. The history of philosophy, rather than repeating what a philosopher says, has to say what he must have taken for granted, what he didn't say, but is nonetheless present in what he did say. And so he proposes that we read philosophy, or the work of a philosopher, in terms of the problems that animate its concepts. And one way that we might begin approaching difference and repetition would be in terms of this question, what is the problem to which the concepts of difference and repetition that he's developing here are responding to? And so did we have any thoughts or remarks? I think we also might put it a little bit in context of the historical setting in which it was written.
Can we say that the key problem that difference and repetition seeks to answer or give a solution to is the primacy of identity?
Yeah, I suppose we have to ask, well, why is it that identity becomes a problem? And so we could distinguish between interphilosophical problems that arise from within the philosophical tradition, and these would go all the way back to, in many respects, the inauguration of philosophy, Western philosophy, anyways, who see as being is and non-being is not, and being turns out as under his line of reasoning to be undifferentiated, one and the same everywhere, and so the differences that we encounter in the world are all an illusion. We can think about the relationship between forms and particulars in Plato that emerged through the primacy of identity, a similar problem that emerges surrounding form and the individual in Aristotle, all the way up through the philosophical tradition. But we have this issue of the primacy of identity. We shouldn't immediately, I think, jump to the conclusion that identity is necessarily a bad thing or something to be rejected. We have to question, well, how is it that the categories of the same, the similar, and the identical that are going to preoccupy Deleuze throughout this book become problematic and pose a problem? And so we know this book, it was published in France in 1968. Deleuze was born in 1925, which makes it a daunting book for somebody to publish at that age. That means he would have been 43 years old when he had completed this work. I find that myself to be rather humbling. And so, of course, he would have, come to adulthood during World War II. He was born in Paris and lived most of his life in Paris, so he lived under the occupation. His brother died as a result of being arrested for participating in the French resistance. He was being transported to the concentration camps. And so he saw quite a bit. And then, of course, we see what is going on in the 1960s. And so when we talk about extra philosophical problems, when it's suggested that maybe we should read philosophical texts in terms of the problems that animate concepts extra philosophically, part of the sort of question we would be raising would be about the sort of historical milieu in which certain concepts become answers to problems that that we're encountering. And so, very early on in the text, in the introduction, did anybody have any comments or remarks in response to that? And from the very first sentence, we see the introduction. This would be on page 1. We see Deleuze drawing a contrast. In that very first paragraph there, he tells us, repetition is not generality, which to me at least is a rather surprising thesis, I think. Repetition and generality must be distinguished in several ways. Every formula which implies their confusion is regrettable. For example, when we say two things are as alike as two drops of water, or when we identify there is only a science of the general with there is only a science of that which is repeated. Repetition and resemblance are different in kind, extremely so. And he goes on to tell us what generality is. He says, generality presents two major orders: the qualitative order of resemblances and the quantitative order of equivalences. Cycles and equalities are their respective symbols. He continues on, the exchange or substitution of particulars defines our context in relation to generality. And so what do you think? What is the issue here?
Is he responding to some degree to like the positivism of the early 20th century within academia?
Within academia? Yeah, I mean, in part, that could be part of the issue here. And I'm not saying I know the answers. I find this a very strange book. I've read it numerous times, and sometimes I think gremlins live inside it because it seems to become a different book every time I read it. The old cliche.
Maybe I'm reading too much into the usage of the word repetition here, but as far as I understand, repetition for him is the repetition of difference. It's production of the new. It's his take on Nietzschean eternal return, and so what repetition actually is differing or change or becoming, which is not the same as two things being alike. That would be predicated on a kind of identity, a stasis that subsists between the two, whereas repetition is the change of is changing or becoming or production.
Other remarks? And so we're told page 1, Kevin. Which passage are you asking about?
Just the one you most recently read. I just dropped in. About generality.
Yeah, we're told with regard to generality that the exchange or substitution of particulars defines our conduct in relation to generality. And so, you know, I think that there are a number of things that we could talk about in this connection with the order of generality. What perhaps is the most interesting to me, you know, being at the level of the political. And so in the order of generality, of course, we would have economic exchange, right? What is it that money does with respect to everything else? It provides a generality by which everything becomes exchangeable and interchangeable with everything else under the order of equivalences. And of course, maybe somebody with better historical knowledge than me, you know, we're beginning in the 1960s, the 1950s, and so on and so forth to get the emergence of consumer culture. And with the emergence of consumer culture, what do we have? We have the commodity, which is being mass produced. And so they're almost Benjaminian resonances here with some of what he says. I don't know that I've ever come across much cross-fertilization between Deleuze and the Frankfurt School, but we might think of art in the age of mechanical reproduction in order of generality and resemblance at work here. If we think of both totalitarianism as well as nationalism, we get an order of generality where identity is supposed to be exchangeable and substitutable for all particulars that belong to that sort of society. And so we see this sort of this shadow of the triumvirate that he's going to talk about a great deal. Let me see if I can find the passages here. Of the same, the similar, and the identical as somehow haunting the entire social field. Let me see if I can find a nice passage for this. Yeah, and so on page 15, Roman numeral 15, in the preface to the English edition, the second paragraph there in the middle, Deleuze writes, perhaps the majority of philosophers had subordinated difference to identity or to the same, to the similar, to the opposed or the analogous. They had introduced into the identity of the they had introduced difference into the identity of the concept. They had put difference in the concept itself, thereby reaching a conceptual difference, but not a concept of. difference. And so we're going to have conceptual difference, which is going to be the order of representation, versus a concept of difference, which is what Deleuze is seeking after. And a great deal of what Deleuze is going to try to subsequently develop is a concept of difference that isn't subordinated to identity, which is one of the most mind-bending things to try and think about this work, because this would be a difference that is not a difference between two things that are themselves identical. It would be a non-negative difference, but as he's going to describe it later on, an internal difference. And so how to think that difference. And we're going to have the perpetual specter of the same, the similar, and the identical that has, he claims, haunted most of Western philosophy. And, you know, I don't know. I mean, for all of you, perhaps you think of it differently. But, I mean, when you just read the very title of this book, I remember the first time I came across it when I was an undergraduate, Difference and Repetition, and the title alone strikes me paradoxical, because we might think of, or might be inclined to think of, repetition as that which is opposed to difference, yet he seems to be offering to us, or suggesting, a very different concept of what is meant by repetition. Do we have any thoughts or remarks here?
Again, I go back to the kind of Nietzschean interpretation of it, in the idea that if you ask yourself what returns at every moment in reality, it's change. It's, you know, the Heraclitus is becoming, right? It's the idea that at every moment, what comes back, what returns, is change, becoming, and that's precisely what repeats at the fundamental level. And our basic idea of repetition, you know, I was at the coffee shop yesterday, I went back there today. That type of repetition kind of conceals the more basic fundamental repetition, which is the repetition of change, or the repetition of difference.
That's rather different, though, right, than the way we ordinarily think about repetition, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Huh?
Absolutely. It took me a long time for me to even kind of wrap my head around this idea, you know, because it's so counterintuitive.
Yeah, I mean, he goes on to say in the second paragraph there on page 1, and it really ends up working out quite nicely, I think. He says, by contrast, and so where with generality we had cycles, exchanges, and substitutions, he says, by contrast, we can see that repetition is a necessary and justified conduct only in relation to that which cannot be replaced. Repetition as a conduct and as a point of view concerns non-exchangeable and non-substitutable singularities. Reflections, echoes, doubles, and souls do not belong to the domain of resemblance or equivalence, and it is no more possible to exchange one's soul than to substitute real twins for one another. If exchange is the criterion of generality, theft and gift are those of repetition. There is therefore an economic difference between the two. And so, with repetition, at least as an initial gloss, and what's so interesting here is he's going to broaden repetition. It's going to be a phenomena both of the natural world as well as the psychological world. And so, John, that might be some stuff that's of interest to you and your psychoanalytic background there, as well as the ethical world. Repetition is going to pertain that which cannot be replaced or exchanged. It pertains to, he says, the non-exchangeable, the non-substitutable. And in this chapter, he's going to go on a little bit later and say that repetition is difference without a concept. We're going to have to figure out next week, what is Deleuze referring to when he refers to concept, to concepts, in order to suss that out. But it seems that what he is attempting to preserve, the problem that he is responding to with this text, is that which cannot be exchanged, that which falls outside of the order of generality. Dave, that would be page 1, second paragraph. All right, so for tonight, I'm going to leave it there with that, with these provisional orientations as to thinking of the concepts of difference and repetition in terms of the problems which might send these concepts to us. Next week, we'll begin with the introduction. Who was it that said that they would be presenting it next week? Was it?
I said I could do it. Julian?
Julian, okay. And so Julian will be leading us off with some questions or remarks. That does not need to be a serious or extensive thing. Maybe 3 or 4 questions. If you want to make that a little bit more involved, that's fine as well. But it should be with an eye towards setting up some discussion between us. And over the weekend, I will get up on the course homepage a schedule of the readings, and we can have a discussion on the course homepage as to who would like to lead off each week with each set of questions. Does this sound good?
Yeah.
Great.
Could I ask just a question about repetition? I feel like my mind is kind of slowly catching up to our discussion. And just maybe if you could elaborate a bit about what for Deleuze makes repetition so different than reflection or echoes and doubles, as he says. I'm having trouble seeing. It seems like he's just chosen this one term that really, when you get down to it, it means something repeating itself, something similar. But for him, it becomes something so different. This repetition of difference, or this way of getting away from generality, or being precisely not generality. But I'm having trouble seeing why that term is so unique or so different, I guess.
Does anyone else have thoughts here? Yeah, that's the issue I was alluding to. Often we think of repetition as being the exact opposite of what it is that he's suggesting it is. And so it's startling to see repetition as the domain of difference rather than as the domain of generality.
Does it have to do with how Deleuze thinks about concepts? I know in What is Philosophy, he talks about, he has a chapter on the concept and talks about how philosophers create concepts. That's what philosophers do. And sometimes those concepts won't work for you. So for some people, repetition won't work. And if repetition doesn't work for you, then just ignore it and move on to a different concept. And I just wonder how that works here. Deleuze is creating a concept to solve a problem, and that might work for some people. It doesn't work for others. So he's trying to develop the system and thinking about different areas of philosophy, such as metaphysics, and are really dealing with the history of metaphysics and thinking about difference and repetition. I don't know if this solves the problem, but I think understanding how Deleuze uses concepts might help us think about why he uses this specific concept.
Yeah, I would like to take Deleuze at his word, though, and, begin from the premise that he is making arguments, he is making claims, that we shouldn't necessarily see these concepts as simply pragmatic tools that we can pick up or abandon. And maybe it's a somewhat heretical thing to suggest about Deleuze, but that perhaps he's trying to get things right. That he thinks that in the history of metaphysics, with the primacy of identity, it has gotten something fundamentally wrong in treating identity as the first term. That we need a concept of difference to explain a variety of things about the nature of being and existence of the world that we live in. And this will come up a little bit more when we get to the first chapter, Difference in Itself, the problems that emerge when we begin from the idea of identity as primary. We lose the world, in other words. And so I do think that we have to be able to respond to who was it that raised the question? Julian, was that you?
Yeah.
To the question, repetition, and why, in particular, if I understand your question properly, Julian, why is repetition this? How is it that repetition differs from the order of generality? Why is it not the order of the same? Now, later on in the introduction, he is going to suggest that the order of generality itself is a kind of surface effect, a byproduct of this deeper differential repetition that he's seeking to theorize or conceptualize in this text. This comes up in particular, and maybe Joanne can help us out with this later on with her art background, when he talks about things like repeating motifs in paintings and in music, where at least when I look at the repeating design on a wall, say if we're talking about Islamic artwork and decoration, for example, where we see the same pattern repeating over and over again, it looks like we're dealing with an order of generality where everything's the same, but he tries to make the suggestion that no, there's a differential element that lurks beneath that is the genetic condition, the generating condition for this pattern that repeats. There is an inequality or a disequilibrium that conditions that entire pattern, and we're going to see if we are able to make much sense of that. But he does just that to repeat is to behave. This is the third paragraph, in a certain manner, but in relation to something unique or singular which has no equal or equivalent. And he goes on to give a rather nice example, 2 sentences down. He says, this is the apparent paradox of festivals. They repeat an unrepeatable. They do not add a second or third time to the first, but carry the first time to the nth power. With respect to this power, repetition interiorizes and thereby reverses itself. As Piguet says, it is not Federation Day which commemorates or represents the fall of the Bastille, but the fall of the Bastille, which celebrates and repeats in advance all the Federation days, or Monet's first water lily, which repeats all the others. And so in order of each term in the series, beginning with the first Federation Day, the fall of the Bastille, would be equivalent to all of the others, just like any dollar bill is equivalent to any other dollar bill, or 5 single dollar bills are equivalent to a $5 bill, and so on and so forth. They would be the same. But the repetition of the holiday subsequent to that event can't be exchanged for the initial founding event itself. it's conduct in regard to something that is singular and irreplaceable. And John, with your background, I'd be interested to hear, what you might have to say about this, not to put you on the spot or anything like that, but certainly within a psychoanalytic context, we have the order of the symptom, which is a repetition
So
in the life of a patient, and it's not a generality. The symptom is absolutely singular.
So what comes to mind in this particular discussion of repetition, the way that it was just being differentiated between the event that the holiday marks and then the marking of the holiday, the repetition of the holiday, Bastille Day. So, in Seminar 11, Lacan draws upon Aristotle to talk about two different kinds of repetition, one being TK and one being automaton. And it's a very similar conception of repetition. So the TK is this trauma that happens by chance. It's a kind of singular encounter that founds the possibility for repetition as such, which is the symptom.
He calls it the mystic.
Right.
In Seminar 11, and it's paradoxical the way he talks about it, because the trauma of the TK, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, right? Like, the car accident, it could be a good thing as well. Like, winning the lottery can be maybe a TK.
Sure.
That's experienced or encountered as traumatic. Did you want to go on and contrast that?
Just the idea that, it sort of founds the possibility for symbolic repetition, which is this other order of repetition as such. So symbolic repetition involves this other form of repetition, this by chance, singular, missed encounter, in order to have a repetition. So like a neurotic symptom, right, which is repetition, it's a kind of symbolic repetition, is founded upon this sort of missed encounter of a event that did or did not occur. It's fundamentally different than some other symptoms that we might discuss that aren't linked to repetition in the same order. For example, a psychotic symptom maybe has a different relationship to repetition. And I also just, as I'm saying this, it occurs to me that I think the last paragraph of Seminar 11, Lacan talks about absolute difference. The analyst's desire to obtain a absolute difference.
Mm-hmm.
So they're definitely in the same territory in difference in repetition and some of the things Lacan's discussing in Seminar 11.
Yeah, it's clear that he read Lacan very carefully. I've never been able to find out whether or not he actually attended the seminar or not. And Seminar 11 would have been a few years. I think, would it be about a decade before this was published, or was it 1962?
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah, something like that, 62, I think. Yeah.
But there are certainly strong resonances there. But, we also have the this sort of repetition. I'll never forget in the case of my daughter when she was very young. She must have been about 2 years old, and she got a case of pink eye, and she didn't know how to speak yet or understand what was going on, and we had to put eye drops in her eye to treat that. And it was a very unpleasant experience for her because in order to do this, and she couldn't explain to her why this had to be done, you had to hold her down on the floor, right, and pin her arms and put the little drops in the corner of her eye, so when she opened it, they would drip into her eyes and she would be crying. It must have been terrible. And, much to my surprise, I was absolutely shocked. 2 or 3 weeks later, what do I see? I see there she is with her little stuffed animal, Beeps the cat, and a mustard ball or bottle from her kitchen. And she's just laughing hysterically, holding this cat down, using the mustard bottle to put these drops in the eye of her cat. And so this is a sort of, it's not, right, the repetition of the act of what she had undergone in this case isn't exchangeable with the event itself that she went through, yet it is a repetition of that. I don't know, John, if you would classify that as a trauma or not, maybe a low-level traumatic symptom.
I don't know.
But, a repetition in a certain way of this experience a conduct with respect to the singular and what is non-exchangeable.
Sure. Just to offer a little parenthetical comment that happened today, actually. So I was, of course, knew that I was going to take this course tonight, and had this book in my bag with the title on it. And I was discussing a case in analytic supervision. Without being particular, it was a case of a young boy with autism. So it's very interesting because I was talking about how to work with this boy who we played the same scenario for 5 months straight, essentially, and how to introduce difference precisely into this highly repetitive scenario in a way that he can tolerate. And it's just something to think about, these different forms of repetition, in different kinds of subjectivities too, that this, I think Deleuze's differentiation of repetition can help us think about. So when we think about repetition as always being related in a kind of common apprehension of it to the same, the similar, the identical, it misses some other layers that repetition might unfold that are nonetheless repetition.
Absolutely. And it's about brute and mechanical repetition versus this more subterranean differential type repetition,
Right.
and tries to draw a strong distinction between these two things. And, I think one of the things that we should be careful of, one of the issues that I've had perhaps with some of the Deleuzean secondary literature is that there's sometimes a tendency to just treat representation as if it's something that's not real, that it's not there, or the order of generality as if it's something that doesn't exist, or the identical, the same, and the similar. Deleuze is still under an obligation to give us some sort of philosophical account, some sort of ontological account of things like representation, identity, the same, and the similar. Just like the philosopher of identity that begins from the standpoint of identity finds themselves encountering the problem of difference and needs to give us an account of that, the reverse problem emerges as well. How are we to explain the genesis of things like the mechanical and the brute and the general if ultimately at the most fundamental level of being is differential? And so I think that's a good place to stop for this evening. Next week we will, if nobody objects, next week we will begin to get into the nuts and bolts of the text and look at the lines of argument that he develops in the introduction here. And we'll go from there. So thank you, all of you, for being here this evening. And hopefully we have some good discussion next week. Any remarks before we close out?
No, thank you very much.
Yes.
Oh, Dave?
This is working. Okay. Did you say that the next thing is chapter 3?
No, we're going to start with the introduction. And so we're going to need to go into some detail in the introduction about the relationship between difference and repetition. And so that will be the two prefaces and up through page 27. And then the following week, I think it's a good idea to jump ahead to chapter 3. The reading or the reason for that being that in chapter 3 he gives a critique about what it is that he's opposing in the philosophical tradition and trying to outline what his alternative is. And so that'll provide us a bit of a launching point for jumping into the body of the text itself, starting with chapter 1, difference in itself. Anything else? All right, so good discussion. I look forward to seeing all of you next week.
Thank you, Levi. Thank you, everyone. And before everyone leaves, I just want to remind you that email is how we are going to be contacting you about like sort of updates and things that are going on. And if you had any issues today, or if you want to like switch your contact, your email, then let us know so that next time we have everybody here. Yeah, thank you, Levi. Thank you, everyone. And I guess that's a wrap. See you next week.
See you next week.
All right.
See you later.
All right,
Thanks.
Bye, thanks.
Okay, hello.
Hello.
Hi. So I definitely had problems with the email. Still didn't get one.
Yes.
I was only able to get in because Michael Downs
Okay.
shared a link.
All right.
And
Sorry, I'm gonna. One moment. I'm gonna